Welcome to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Leaders of the world's two most powerful nations take it inside.
As always, there's no substitute to face-to-face discussions.
President Biden and Xi meet for 4 hours, trying to keep competition from becoming conflict.
If you're talking, at least, then you're not fighting. That's how bad things are.
From the radiology to the dialysis department, Israeli soldiers move room to room through Al-Shifa hospital.
We're not capturing the hospital or overtaking the hospital.
And if it's not one thing, it's another. A new book looks at the age of permacrisis. President Biden called his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping Wednesday, quote, the most constructive and productive discussion we've had. It was the first time the world leaders met in person in a year. Biden called the meetings a success and celebrated the reopening of communication lines between the country's two militaries.
We're reassuming military-to-military contacts, direct contacts. As a lot of you press know, follow this, that's been cut off, and it's been very worrisome. That's how accidents happen, misunderstandings. So we're back to direct, open, clear, direct communications. And it's important for the world to see that we're implementing the approach in the best traditions of American diplomacy. We're talking to our competitors, and the key, and just talking, just being blunt with one another, so there's no misunderstanding, as a key element to maintaining global stability and delivering for the American people.
For more on what came from President Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping of China and his subsequent news conference, here's CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Zhang.
John, President Biden came into this summit saying that if he was able to leave and reestablish communications, especially with regard to from the U.S. military to the Chinese military, then he would define that as a success. And now he is able to do that, because that was the top line of what the president announced today in terms of what the two leaders agreed to after their 4-hour-long summit behind closed doors. He also said that they agreed to crack down on the illegal production of fentanyl by targeting the Chinese companies that produce and export the ingredients that are used to make the opioid. They are exported, then make their way to the southern border, and then, of course, have flooded the United States, which has become such an issue for so many people here. The president also talked about their commitment to artificial intelligence, to getting experts together to curb it in a way where it can be productive and not dangerous. And so in the administration's view and the president's view, he would consider this a successful summit with a leader who he mentioned he had very direct talks with. They talked about everything from the war in Gaza to Ukraine, and to really trying to reestablish their relationship as well. And White House official briefing reporter said that, you know, it's not so easy as just picking up the phone and calling each other, but at this point they would be confident that if needed, they could have a talk if the president wanted. So he is now going to leave this summit with Xi Jinping having achieved what he had basically set out to do. John?
We are now going to talk again with Jake Werner, who is very patient. He is the acting director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. Jake, so back on the question of China, what did you make of the president's remarks?
I think the press conference illustrated quite nicely why it is that the United States wants to have a stable relationship with China. There are so many demands on American leaders right now, Israel, Gaza, foremost among them, but of course, Ukraine, Russia came up, and all of the potential problems that we can get in the global economy as a result of climate change. There are a million problems that the U.S. government is facing right now in the world. And on many of these issues, Chinese interests are well aligned, or they could be potentially supportive of American goals. In contrast to to Iran and to Russia, the U.S. and Chinese interests overlap significantly more. And it's important, I think, to recognize that, to understand why Biden wants to have a stable relationship with China, so that because, of course, China is the second most powerful country in the world, could make significantly more trouble for the United States if we find ourselves in a position of permanent hostility than even Russia or Iran could.
You could see the president being extremely careful with his words about questions of Taiwan and basically everything that he was talking about with China. But he was, to the extent that he slipped into his more casual mode, it was to talk about how long he has known Xi Jinping and talked about that idea of being able to call each other on the phone if anything was amiss. How important do you think that is in terms of the limited goals of where this relationship is right now, which is to try to inch back away from the difficulty they've had?
It is important. It's important to maintain those communications. Having that ability to talk in the event of a crisis is something that the Chinese side has really resisted. They've tended to say that the United States is the one causing the crisis, and the U.S. just wants to push China and push China and push China, and then have this crisis line in order to defuse any problems that come up from that. So the fact that China was willing to agree to that, the fact that China also agreed on fentanyl, the fact that they're talking seriously about the potential dangers that artificial intelligence poses, all of these I think are really positive signs. It still remains the case that there are these deep structural problems in the relationship, though, and sooner or later those are going to have to be addressed as well.
Jake Werner, acting director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. Thank you, Jake. You've been with us for almost the whole hour. We really appreciate your context here and your expertise. Thank you.
Very glad to be on. Thank you.
Now to the Middle East. Our focus is once again on Gaza's largest hospital, crippled and occupied by the suffering and now soldiers. The IDF claims it carried out a, quote, precise and targeted operation against Hamas at Al-Shifa Hospital. The IDF also says it hasn't found any members of Hamas nor any evidence of hostages being held there. It did find weapons. The Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health released this video of medics trying to evacuate patients ahead of the Israeli troops entering the facility. Thousands of people were sheltering there, as many believed it was the safest place to go. Our Deborah Pata leads off our coverage, and we warn you, some of the images you are about to see may be distressing.
The target, Al-Shifa. The decision to send troops into the hospital, marking an escalation in Israel's offensive in Gaza. When Israeli soldiers finally entered, not a single shot was fired.
There is an AK-47.
But they say they found proof that Hamas was operating there, showing this as evidence.
These weapons have absolutely no business being inside a hospital.
What they did not show were any Hamas fighters, and they made no mention of the tunnels they've repeatedly said double up as the group's command center underneath the complex. Also inside the besieged hospital, civilians seeking refuge and critically ill patients, their presence fueling international calls for a ceasefire. A place of healing turned into a battle zone.
Continuous shooting that we have now. But again, it's totally a scary situation.
Since yesterday, medical staff have moved patients to safer areas through dusty, smoke-filled corridors. Here, you see a doctor manually trying to give this little girl oxygen. The IDF says they dropped off desperately needed medical supplies before the raid. Far from Al-Shifa, another battle is being fought. Worn out and angrier by the day, the families of some of the more than 200 people taken hostage by Hamas, demanding their government does more to bring their loved ones home. We want answers and action, Netanyahu Sheli Shem Tov said. We have no strength anymore.
Deborah Pata joins me now. Deborah, I want to start with the Al-Shifa Hospital. Do we know how long these raids might go on? What is the objective? What do we know?
Well, the Al-Shifa really is a symbol of what is going on in this war right now. It's become the center of very competing narratives. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, say the tunnels below double up as a command center for Hamas beneath the complex, and that Hamas is using civilians as human shields, while the Hamas-run health ministry denies this and says the IDF has no justification for entering a medical facility that is treating hundreds of wounded patients and has several dozen babies who are premature and many people who are seeking shelter there. The IDF came out today with that video, which you saw in the piece, which shows some weapons, computers, a few sets of body armor. But more interesting is what they didn't find. They did not find any Hamas fighters, they say, and there was no mention of the tunnels that they've been speaking a lot about. So we're not sure how long this is going to go on for. Part of it is that they probably are also trying to see if they can find hostages. But there is no evidence of any hostages there either. They will take things for forensic investigation, and there could be more information coming out on that. But what we know at this point is that it's the civilians who continue to bear the brunt of this war. It's a dire situation inside the hospital and outside the hospital, with bodies piling up because it's too dangerous to attempt to bury them. The morgues are overflowing, and the health system has collapsed inside.
The IDF says it delivered incubators to Al-Shifa. Does that meet the need? Is that all they delivered, and how was that received?
It's not clear if those incubators did or did not reach the hospital. We know the IDF says they dropped off medical supplies. All we've seen are boxes. We understand that the incubators that they were going to deliver are battery-powered and were probably more useful for helping with an evacuation. It certainly wouldn't meet the long-term need of babies who need to be in incubators. But it's all very unclear, and we're not even sure if the hospital at this point actually got the incubators. At some point, they will try and evacuate them, we assume. But how they do that, it's going to take a lot of planning. It's going to be very, very difficult, and they're very worried. At the moment, the doctors inside say they're losing around 5 patients a day. We're not just talking about the babies now. We're talking about adults as well who are on some kind of life support, critical care, or need oxygen. Oxygen is also something that they're battling with. So it's very unclear and very murky, as it usually is in war.
And finally, as you mentioned in your piece, the families of Israeli hostages are marching for 5 days from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Firstly, what's the Netanyahu administration response? And secondly, what do we know about the hostages? And are any of these families calling for a ceasefire from the government?
There have been some families who have indeed done that, and certainly the mood within the families, some of them has shifted. With this march, it's an angry march. People are angry, they are fed up, they are worn out, as one can imagine. Nearly 6 weeks on, and they have not got news of their loved ones. Their loved ones have not been returned, and they blame the government. They're demanding that the government do more to ensure that something happens, that they secure the release of their loved ones. They're watching the bombardment of Gaza. It's horrifying for these parents as they agonize over the safety of their loved ones and worry about them. Benjamin Netanyahu is a divisive leader right now, and his popularity is at an all-time low. One poll even suggested as low as 4%. So a lot of blame is being leveled at him, and the relatives are saying that, in fact, some of their loved ones were kidnapped because of the security failures of Netanyahu's government. One person saying, quite bluntly, the problem is not Hamas, it is you, and that's why we don't have our loved ones back. So you're seeing a lot of anger there from those families. At this point, there is no breakthrough in those negotiations. They continue in Qatar, but there has been no significant announcement or sense that something is going to happen. That could all change in the next few days, as these things are wont to do.
Deborah Pata in East Jerusalem for us. Deborah, thank you so much. Before President Biden speaks, which we expect to happen relatively shortly, a little background on his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. It was the first in-person meeting for the two world leaders in a year on Wednesday. The goal, to stabilize relations between the U.S. and China that some experts say are at a 40-year low. CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Zhang is in California with more.
A handshake and high stakes. President Biden and China's Xi Jinping met today outside San Francisco. They had gone a year without even speaking on the phone. In that time, tensions have soared in the South China Sea with dozens of aggressive maneuvers by the Chinese Air Force. Mr. Biden told Xi they need to be in closer touch.
I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication.
The president also hoped to reestablish communications between the U.S. and Chinese militaries, suspended after then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August 2022, enraging China's leadership. After the U.S. shot down a Chinese spy balloon off the coast of South Carolina this past February, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin could not reach his Chinese counterpart. 3 weeks later, Nora spoke to Admiral Samuel Paparo for 60 minutes aboard the USS Nimitz, which had just left the South China Sea.
If the U.S. and Chinese militaries can't communicate over a Chinese spy balloon, then what's going to happen when there's a real crisis in the South China Sea or with Taiwan?
We'll hope that they'll answer the phone. Else, we'll do our very best assessment based on the things that they say in open source and based on their behavior to divine their intentions, and we'll act accordingly.
Doesn't that make the situation even more dangerous if U.S. and Chinese militaries are not talking?
Yes.
President Biden used today's meeting to try to lower the temperature.
We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict.
Addressing President Biden, Xi said conflict and confrontation would have unbearable consequences.
8 Las Vegas teens have been arrested on murder charges in connection with the brutal killing of a classmate earlier this month. CBS's Carter Evans reports authorities believe the attack was over a pair of stolen headphones.
Cell phone video shows a group of teens attacking 17-year-old Jonathan Lewis Jr.
10 subjects immediately swarm him, put him into the ground, and begin kicking, punching, and stomping on him.
Investigators say the beating occurred in an alley just a block from their high school in Las Vegas. A fight over a pair of stolen headphones and possibly a marijuana vape pen. The teenage attackers left Lewis lying on the ground, unconscious.
A citizen nearby saw him, began attending to him, and carried him back to Rancho High School.
He died 6 days later from blunt force trauma.
It's obviously your parents' worst nightmare.
Jonathan Lewis Sr. held his son's hand while he was on life support.
There's just an absolute need for the community to begin teaching conflict resolution for our children.
The Clark County Sheriff says 8 of the 10 suspects are already in custody facing murder charges. The DA says the 4 oldest teens will be tried as adults. The rest could face the same fate after a court hearing.
This should be a reminder to all of us to have those difficult conversations with our children. Their actions have life-altering consequences.
When you go and you harm somebody else, all that you're doing is letting down everyone around you because they're the one that's going to end up with their life messed up.
There's no evidence this was a hate crime, and investigators say Lewis wasn't even there to fight. He just jumped in to help a friend. And sadly, it cost him his life. Sean.
Carter Evans, thank you. Coming up after the break, passing the hot potato. Meta wants Congress to make other tech companies protect young social media users. Plus, the 14th Amendment says no person shall hold office if they engage in an insurrection. In 3 states, judges are looking into whether that applies to Donald Trump. We'll look at the rulings and the law. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Hunter Biden has asked the judge overseeing his criminal gun case to subpoena former President Donald Trump, former Attorney General Bill Barr, and other Justice Department officials. The subpoenas would require all recipients to turn over any documents from the start of Trump's presidential term related to Hunter Biden. Biden's legal team argues that the investigations into him are politically motivated. Last month, the president's son pleaded not guilty to felony charges that he lied about his drug use while trying to purchase a handgun. A Michigan judge dismissed a lawsuit Tuesday that argued former President Donald Trump should not be on the state's Republican primary ballot in 2024. A group of voters brought the suit based on a clause in the 14th Amendment. Section 3 of that amendment prevents anyone from holding public office if they have participated in an insurrection. Judge James Redford, who previously worked for the former Republican governor, said the issue was up to Congress. But he also left the door open for future legal challenges, saying the question of whether Donald J. Trump is qualified to appear on the 2024 general election ballot is not ripe for adjudication at this time. Minnesota's Supreme Court, the majority of whom were appointed by Democrats, rejected a similar lawsuit last week, and closing arguments for another 14th Amendment case in Colorado began Wednesday. To help us understand the legal reasoning behind these decisions, we are joined by Professor Mark Graber from University of Maryland's Carey Law School. Professor, first, let's start with the Michigan case. Why would the Michigan judge say this is for Congress to decide?
Well, he claimed to be deciding it on something called the political question doctrine, namely that the Constitution leaves some questions, for example, what constitutes a valid impeachment for Congress and not the courts. He claimed that Section 3 was a political question to be resolved by Congress, whether someone has engaged in an insurrection, not by the courts.
Now, since this is a state question, is that a solid legal reasoning that he has there? Or because it's a state issue, why wouldn't it be up to either the state legislature or a judge within the state in which it's a question?
Problematic for a number of reasons. To begin with, the Congress that passed and ratified Section 3 thought, in fact, states could determine whether former Confederates in the states had engaged in an insurrection. Section 3 says Congress, by a 2/3 vote, can waive the disqualification, but that presumes disqualification takes place elsewhere, and the most logical place for it to take place is in the states.
So several conservative legal scholars have argued that the 14th Amendment claims are valid, at least that this is, ripe for a reasonable minds to have a debate about. But the judges in both Michigan and Minnesota dismissed these cases without even evaluating the merits. What is the disconnect there between legal scholars who think this is reasonable, at least to debate, and judges who say it's not even worth looking at the details?
Necessarily a disconnect. What both judges decided was that Michigan and Minnesota law did not permit the Secretary of State to intervene at the primary level, given the primary concerned a party's choice of candidates and was not an election for an office. Both Michigan and Minnesota left open the possibility that disqualification could take place in a general election, which is for an office of the federal government.
So when the Michigan judge says that it's not ripe for adjudication, the question of the 2024 general election is not ripe yet for adjudication, does that essentially mean two things? A, it's not ripe because he hasn't won the nomination yet and he's not on the federal ballot. And B, does it open the door to the possibility that it could be ripe for adjudication within the state?
Both A and B. What he has said is, I'm simply making a decision about the power of the Secretary of State during a primary. I'm leaving open the possibility that during the general election, no person can be on the ballot who, in fact, is disqualified from holding the office. This was, in fact, what the Union Army did in 1868 after Section 3 was ratified. If people tried to run, they wouldn't let them run. As General Terry said, the ballot would be counted as blank.
So then as a final question, Professor, if this becomes, what is the standard really then, if this does get to a little further down the road, that should be applied, the test that should be applied to the former president in these cases?
It is very simple. It's a civil proceeding, so we use preponderance of evidence. Did Donald Trump, while president of the United States, engage in an insurrection? And by this is meant, did he knowingly participate in any way in an effort to resist the implementation of any American law by force or violence for a public reason, namely to try and change the result of the election? That's the standard. Someone someday should determine whether the events of January 6th, before and after, meet that standard.
Professor Mark Graber with the University of Maryland Carey Law School, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
New Hampshire has selected January 23rd as the date of its presidential primary, defying the plans of President Biden and the Democratic National Committee. The 23rd gives the Granite State the first in the nation primary, which it has held for over a century. Democrats, however, intended South Carolina to be the first primary due to the state's racially diverse population, which the party says is more representative of the party. Because of this, President Biden did not file for his name to appear on New Hampshire's primary ballot. And by jumping the line, New Hampshire's delegates will not be counted towards the Democratic nomination.
Ooh, 5 cents each. Junk. Junk. The airplane's upside down.
Once again, our friend Homer illuminates life's important lessons. Mistakes are valuable. Those upside-down planes he tossed away refer to the famous sheet of them mistakenly printed by a post office in 1918. One stamp from that run just sold for $2 million. This is the world's most expensive stamp, originally going for only 24 cents. It's called the Inverted Jenny, after the Curtiss JN biplane on it, which is known as, you guessed it, a Jenny. The stamp that sold last week was in perfect condition after decades in a safe, but a few of the 100 inverted Jennies in existence have also sold for 6 figures in recent years. So, if you find one in a junk box, don't throw it out. A college professor, former prime minister, and a Nobel laureate log into a Zoom. That's not the setup to a joke. It's the genesis of a book about our global challenges and how to solve them. We'll speak with one of the authors. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Welcome back to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Here are some additions to our top stories. President Biden meets with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, for the first time in a year. Their talks are aimed at strengthening the fraught ties between the two nations. The Israeli military stormed Gaza's largest hospital as part of what it's calling a targeted operation against Hamas. The IDF says it found weapons and a command center inside. It did not find evidence of hostages. Defense officials say a Navy warship shot down a drone launched from Yemen. We're told it was headed towards the destroyer USS Thomas Hudner and was taken down over the Red Sea. It's not clear who launched the drone, but it's suspected an Iranian-backed group is behind the incident. Our Holly Williams spoke with Iran's foreign minister, who is denying the country's involvement in the Red Sea incident.
The U.S. says fighters backed by Iran have been attacking American forces in the Middle East with drones and rockets for weeks. Tonight, Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, told us his country is not responsible and denied any involvement in today's drone attack in the Red Sea.
We really didn't want this crisis to expand, but the U.S. has been intensifying the war in Gaza by throwing its support behind Israel.
It sounds like you're saying that Iran backs these groups around the Middle East, including the Houthis, including fighters in Iraq and Syria, but you bear no responsibility for what they do.
These groups in Iraq and Syria that are attacking U.S. interests have made their own decisions.
Iran is also a backer of Hamas, and the U.S. says that makes it complicit in the October 7th attacks on Israel. The minister told us the attacks were a response to 75 years of Israeli occupation.
So are you saying that Hamas was justified in killing civilians, including children?
As I said, we are opposed to killing women and children everywhere.
It's a very simple question, Minister. Is it justified what Hamas did on October 7th?
What Hamas did was based on its legitimate right to defend itself.
The US and Iran both say they want to stop the Israel-Hamas war from spreading. but that's about all they agree on. Holly Williams, CBS News, Geneva, Switzerland.
The Supreme Court in the United Kingdom has ruled that the country cannot deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson first announced plans for a Rwandan relocation program in 2022. Current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak vowed to support that policy during his campaign. In Wednesday's unanimous decision, justices sided with an appeals court which found that the East African nation is not safe for refugees. They emphasized that plans to deport asylum seekers there would breach both British and international law. Ukrainian authorities have arrested a member of parliament who helped former President Trump's lawyer Rudy Giuliani in his search for dirt on President Biden and his son Hunter Biden in 2019. Oleksandr Dubinsky has been charged with treason for allegedly working to help Russia in its war against Ukraine. He's also accused of spreading fake information about Ukraine's political and military leadership. If found guilty, Dubinsky faces up to 15 years in prison. Two other officials have also been accused of operating at the behest of Russian intelligence. If you watch this show, if you've watched it for a while, it can feel like we return to the same kinds of crises with no solution in sight. Economic turmoil, political unrest, environmental challenges, immigration flows. There is a word for that, permacrisis. And these issues are often only addressed in a patchwork fashion or not at all. And they will only be solved if their nations change their institutional approaches to problem solving. That is the argument from Michael Spence and his co-authors in the book, Permacrisis. He's joining us, Michael Spence is. He's a Nobel laureate in economics, in addition to being the co-author of this book. So thank you for being with us, Michael. Tell us, if you would, the genesis of this book and what you and your co-authors were first trying to identify, and then what you're trying to achieve with the book itself.
So when we started, we're old friends, the three of us, but we started talking to each other, John, very regularly during the pandemic, in part because the pandemic was a pretty big shock, but in part because we all three felt there was some fairly fundamental changes going on in the global economy and the global system. And then about a year and a half into that, we decided maybe we should try to write something, and that's the origin of this book.
And so lay out for us what you're seeing, some of the headwinds and tailwinds facing the world today.
Well, so I think the headwinds are, largely coming from the supply side. So we lived in a world that had massive amounts of productive capacity brought into it via emerging economy growth. It was a deflationary environment for several decades. And that's really, all of that's fading away on us now. We also live in a world where the global supply chains are being put together with much greater attention to resilience and security, national security, and so on. And that's producing a pattern of diversification and fragmentation in the global economy. We have declining productivity. We've got aging in economies that account for 75% of the global economy's output. So when you add them all together, you've got headwinds that we haven't faced for a long, long time. And part of the result of that is that when you get a demand surge of the kind that we had after the pandemic, you get inflation, which we haven't seen for a long time either.
So one of the things you write about is that policy solutions aren't very robust. They're not robust enough to meet all of those underlying challenges that you've articulated, and maybe even some others. So what is the solution? Does the solution require a mindset change in the way we think about the global economy? And is that the precondition for policies that are going to be more durable?
Yes, I think it does require a mindset change. We're probably going to live in a world in which, sort of things that are sometimes called industrial policies are more important. The kind of ensuring that we're building the kind of productivity enhancing technology base of the economy. But when you have a generation and a half of people who've lived in an environment, basically since the Volcker era, that had relatively low interest rates and relatively little inflation, the mindsets don't change immediately, and that leads to a certain number of mistakes and accidents. And we, think of it this way, John. We have a pretty highly levered global economy. The pandemic made that worse because we had to lever up on the sovereign debt side in order to protect the household and business sectors, right? Now we have rising interest rates, very rapid rising interest rates. And so, this is just a different world that's going to have to adjust fairly quickly to a new set of interest rates and prices.
And so when you talk about the Volcker, Paul Volcker, I assume you're referring to there from the 80s. Is this, as a final question, does that mean that the Fed has it wrong, that basically policy solutions to this current moment are basically stuck in the 80s and there need to be new ones?
No, not quite. I mean, let's take the period not since Volcker, because a lot of things happened in that intervening period. But since the great financial crisis, where we had an enormous amount of balance sheet damage as a direct result of the crisis, the Fed has been in the business of trying to prop up the demand side of the economy. That's not what we need now, and that's not what they're doing. They're busy cutting the demand side down so that the inflationary pressures that were triggered as we came out of the pandemic are eliminated. I don't have any doubt that they'll succeed in that in some form or other. But that's what's causing, on the demand side, what's going on. The real problem is the supply side's not helping. It's going the other direction.
All right.
For now. I mean, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. You can make final point quickly. Go ahead.
There's an optimistic thing, which was we have powerful technological tools that can produce a productivity surge and relieve some of these pressures. They won't happen next year or, maybe in the year after. But by the end of the decade, we argue that we could be in a very different environment in terms of the way it feels and its momentum.
Michael Spence, Nobel laureate and co-author of Permacrisis. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, John.
Something to be thankful for this year, cheaper Thanksgiving feasts. We'll show you which menu items will cost you less. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. As tens of millions of Americans get ready to have Thanksgiving dinner with their families, they will also be thankful for some relief in food prices. According to the American Farm Bureau's survey, this year's holiday feast for 10 people will cost just over $61. That's down 4.5% compared to 2022. Our Jolene Kent reports.
It's down to the wire at Gunthorpe Farms in LaGrange, Indiana. They're packing up the turkeys they've raised and shipping them out for Thanksgiving.
You're in high season right now.
Right, yep.
It's like crunch time.
Yeah, it's crunch time.
Greg Gunthorpe says inflation just won't quit, hitting the farm's bottom line.
Oh, inflation has drastically impacted, our cost of production. Small family farms have a difficult time figuring out where we fit in the future in this with all of this inflation.
And shoppers continue to battle inflation too. While turkey prices sank 16% since last year, many other Thanksgiving staples are more expensive again this year. Canned cranberries will cost 60% more. Canned pumpkin prices have spiked 30%, and russet potatoes are up 14%.
It's super expensive, and I'm sharing the cost with some of my siblings.
Definitely more conscious about what we purchase.
Walmart is now promising to remove inflation by cutting prices on holiday favorites. Aldi slashed prices on more than 70 of the most popular Turkey Day items by up to 50%.
Would you say this is the most aggressive you've cut prices for Thanksgiving ever?
This, without a doubt, this is
Aldi's U.S. CEO, Jason Hart.
Consumers are under pressure, so we'll keep these prices at least through the end of the year.
Are you basically taking a hit on prices because you think you're going to win over customers for the long run here?
That's absolutely the case. That's what we're all about. And all along the way, driving cost out of the business, driving cost out of the product, and passing that savings on to the customer.
Savings that customers say they need this holiday season.
Do you think you'll be able to stay on budget this year?
I think so. I don't know if I'm the right person to be in charge of this, but I'm doing my best.
I don't know if I love it.
Jolene Kent, CBS News, Orland Park, Illinois.
The Labor Department said Tuesday the rise in inflation had slowed. On Wednesday, it said the producer price index also fell by the most in 3.5 years in October. The sharp drop was due in part to falling gas prices. U.S. drivers will save a collective $1.2 billion this Thanksgiving travel period compared to last year. That's according to Gas Buddy. The average price per gallon is down more than 40 cents from a year ago, and more than 50,000 stations now show gas prices at $2.99 a gallon or less. Meta is trying to shift the responsibility of monitoring teen users on Facebook and Instagram to app stores. The social media company is calling on lawmakers to pass legislation requiring parental approval for app store downloads by teens under 16. Meta's global head of safeties says app stores should notify parents when kids download something similar to when they make a purchase. The announcement comes one day after a federal judge ruled Meta and other social media companies are not immune from child safety lawsuits. One day after experiencing 700 earthquakes, Iceland endured another 800 tremors overnight Wednesday. Earthquakes have left their mark on roads, destroying pavement and leaving cracks all over streets. Thousands of people have been evacuated as the country braces for a potential volcanic eruption. This comes as researchers detected sulfur dioxide, a typical indicator that magma is approaching the surface. A series of storms in the Gulf of Mexico are bringing a torrent of rainfall to Florida. Millions of people in the Miami area and other parts of the eastern Florida coast are at risk of flash flooding. For more, here is meteorologist Jackie Jarris from our partners at the Weather Channel.
South Florida will be the main area of concern, with a risk of flash flooding continuing through the overnight hours tonight and into your Thursday morning. We have a new area of low pressure that's developing now, bringing that onshore flow with a tight gradient, gusty winds, and rainfall amounts that could end up in the range of around a foot before the end of the week. A small chance that this could become a tropical depression or storm, but it will have similar impacts with onshore flow. Coastal flooding will be a concern. This is going to be tracking north and northeastward eventually with time and working its way up the eastern seaboard. Right now, it looks like it's going to stay separate from a cold front and just be a big wind maker into the northeast. We will get some rain at the end of the week and into the weekend, but for now, unless that track changes, rainfall amounts should be something we can handle. We're also tracking a storm system in the west, bringing rain and, yes, even thunderstorms at times across parts of California. This will be a storm to track into the southern plains this weekend and early next week, and eventually to the East Coast. Now, for more in-depth coverage, you can watch the Weather Channel on cable and live on your favorite TV streaming device.
Jackie Jarris, thank you. Cambridge's English Dictionary just unveiled its word of the year, and thanks to artificial intelligence, the word has taken on a whole new meaning in 2023. We'll have the reveal next. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. We've been warned that artificial intelligence technology could change our daily lives. Now, it's changing the definitions of words in our dictionaries. According to the Cambridge English Dictionary, the word of 2023 is hallucinate, a verb which traditionally means to sense something that isn't there. But now it's also used to describe what happens when artificial intelligence invents facts out of thin air. So, to use it in a sentence, Google's chatbot hallucinated information that the James Webb Space Telescope is made of cheese. After much debate, the editors of Amazon's book team chose what they say are the 10 best books of the year. Their #1 pick was The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride, a novel about what happens when a skeleton is found at the bottom of an old well in a small Pennsylvania town. The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters came in second. Also on the list is a new biography of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that was nominated for a National Book Award. The remaining books address topics as diverse as dragons, Elon Musk, and a masterful French art thief. Every year, New Zealand holds an online contest for people to vote on the nation's favorite bird. This year, the Puteki, or puking bird, was named Bird of the Century. It earned its nickname for a habit of vomiting to expel parasites. The landslide win comes after late-night host and comedian John Oliver hurled himself behind a vigorous election campaign. He acted as the bird's official campaign manager. Since the endorsement, the contest received more than 350,000 verified votes from almost 200 countries. Here's a look at some of the stories we're covering in our next hour. The U.S. looks to calm tensions with China as President Biden and Xi Jinping meet face-to-face for the first time in a year. Plus, the Israeli military raids Gaza's largest hospital, what they found and what it reveals about Hamas. And we'll speak to economist Michael Spence about global permacrises, how to face them. You're streaming CBS News.